Ladies and gentlemen, Shakaijin and Salaryman, welcome back to another episode of Bento Bureau, the show where we talk about Japan from an international perspective. I'm your host, Bassem. Some people call me Buzz as a nickname. And with me as always, my fellow co-hosts, Bastian Harth from Germany and Long Nguyen from Vietnam. Friends, how's life been treating you? I miss you guys.
I miss you too, Buzz. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. I mean, I wish I can update you on something a little more colorful, but we're all stuck at home most of the time. Well, I'm sure you guys are, going through different phases of the.
On this semester, we are still doing online classes.
Yeah, so. In Long's case, as you guys know, he's based in Sweden, so never really went into a lockdown in the first place. But of course, been social distancing. Am I right?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to introduce today's guest, Brittany Arthur. Brittany, how are you doing? Thanks for joining us today.
I'm doing so good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Brittany Arthur is the founder and CEO at Design Thinking Japan. For those unaware, Design Thinking Japan, let's bring that up for a second. Actually, the website here, designthinkingjapan.com. It's a company that specializes in helping businesses and individuals alike strive for innovation and kind of thinking outside the box here. And as you can see, they kind of have quite a few things going on here. They've got workshops tailored to creatives and entrepreneurs in Japan. Are these workshops conducted mostly in Japanese or English, Brittany?
That's a great question. So we do both. So I'm originally Australian, so my mother language is English, but most of our clients prefer that we do it in Japanese. Every now and then, if we work with a global client, we might actually have like a parallel workshop going on where we have one side of the room doing Japanese and one side of the room doing English. But yeah, the majority of the work that we do is certainly through a Japanese lens and also with the language.
Super interesting stuff, and I'm looking forward to diving a little more into that. But before that, I just wanted to introduce the podcast as well. Great looking podcast. Of course, Brittany is also the host and producer of the Business Karaoke podcast, as you can see here. They've got 18 episodes so far. They publish every week, and they cover business with Japan from a slew of different lenses, from multilingualism to confidence building and digital transformation. Brittany, correct me if I'm going a little wrong here, but let's pause for a second and just appreciate that name there. Actually, that's a great name. That's pretty nice to have. What made you decide on that name in the first place, actually?
So the Business Karaoke, like that name, people fell in love with, and I can't take credit for it. Actually, my fiance was the one that came up with the name. We started talking about innovation, and we started talking about the mindset that's required in order for people to feel engaged and really connected with innovation in Japan. And we noticed that, I'm sure many of you speak Japanese on the call or on this episode, and you'll know that innovation is innovation, which is a katakana word. So it's not necessarily like a Japanese, a value or element. So what we really tried to do was connect something that maybe the Japanese already knew that was already strong in Japanese culture, which was maybe a time where everyone had a voice, that you could have fun, that you could collaborate, that hierarchies didn't matter anymore, that you could try something. It didn't matter if you were good, it didn't matter if you were bad. You just took the mic, and if you didn't sing, then at least you would be cheering people along, that everyone had a role and everyone was engaged. So we wanted to kind of take that craziness, that openness, that collaboration, that fun, that playful, curious spirit that we see in karaoke, and we wanted to translate that into a business setting, because people often say, the Japanese are so reserved, and how do you get people to open up? And as we know, and those of us that have spent time in Japan know, that's true some of the time, but there's this other crazy Japan of karaoke and Takeshi's Castle and Japanese game shows that it's not all serious and it's not all formalities. So that's a little bit behind the Business Karaoke, the idea that we bring the idea, the essence of karaoke to business.
I really love that metaphor.
It's kind of interesting for me to know, how do these things actually match in the business world? As you rightly said, I think the stereotype is that it's kind of really rigorous and hierarchical, and on the other hand, you have What is it called?
Castle.
I love that show, by the way.
Yeah, that was a great show. I love that. But you have these two different worlds, right? And they don't really meet in the real business world, like on a daily basis. So how can you bring it in there, like with your workshops or with the karaoke podcast, the Business Karaoke podcast, or is there still some kind of persistence against these kind of new ways of thinking?
When you're trying to introduce a new way of thinking, what I found to be most effective is starting with something that's relatable to the person that you're trying to engage with. So rather than walking in and saying, this is innovation, this is design thinking, rather than saying that, try to find a way, have a look at this person and have a look at, and reflect a little bit on this person's innovation journey. Are they at the very beginning? Have they heard the word innovation before? Have they only, heard it as a buzzword? Are they looking to learn? So have a look at this person, think a little bit about, what their connection is, what their motivation is, what their experience is with innovation, and then try to work, with them around, through, that way. For someone that's really, especially in Japan, someone that's new to innovation, that's new to this kind of playfulness, openness, curious, storytelling, grabbing the microphone and cheering each other on. For someone that's maybe new to that kind of scene, that's where we really do draw the parallel between karaoke and say, hey, it's just like being in karaoke. So you try to bring an experience that's relevant to them. If we think about, one of the most, common foods, if we think about pasta or ramen, if you go to Europe and you say, or, even for example, if you go to Germany, you can say something like Spätzle or something, you can say, this particular pasta, is it pasta or is it ramen? Well, depending on who you're asking, and the thickness of the pasta and the thickness of the noodles and things like that, you'd get a different question. So what's the point? Do you really want to go and really push, no, this is not spaghetti, this is, ramen, or this is, udon, or this is not fettuccine, or this is, rice, vermicelli rice or whatever, rice noodles. What we're trying to do is, how important is it that we, get into the semantics with this person versus how important is it that we connect with this person and that we communicate our message. So what we just try to do is find where this person is and then meet them where they are, rather than, having them come to us. And this is something that I think is really important for innovation professionals, is you have to carry most of the burden. I'm sorry, that's how it is. You have to carry the burden, you have to carry the risk. It's your responsibility to make this person feel comfortable. It's you're the host. The same way, it's the same as this kind of podcast. So what we're trying to do is find a way that your participants, your clients, whatever it is, feel comfortable that they can open up and take this curious, path of innovation, that's filled with some risk. And, our job is to mitigate that and make this person feel as comfortable as possible.
I have to say, it sounds a bit like you actually like a karaoke box. You provide the screen, you provide the music, and you provide the subtitles so that I can sing along.
Exactly it. That's exactly
for a karaoke box, all this laughter, all this excitement usually comes after the alcohol has been served. Right. But definitely, you're not going to serve them alcohol first.
No, we've had bad experiences. No.
So I was just wondering, how do you get the people to become comfortable?
Yeah.
Let's say that
what's the metaphorical alcohol in a way? What? The metaphorical alcohol. So the metaphorical alcohol, that's a really great point, because as you said, you do kind of have this, walking to karaoke, you have this moment where you can pour people alcohol, and that's kind of the social gauge of, okay, you can say something or whatever. So what we try to do is to create expectations. So our metaphorical alcohol is creating expectations and setting very clear engagement kind of rules in a way, or guidelines. So we say things like there's only one conversation at a time, and everybody, everyone has an idea, and let's go for if we're in a divergence phase, then we prioritize quantity over quality, and things like that. So in order for people to get that similar feeling, as you mentioned, along with the idea of alcohol, if we can't use alcohol, we try to create very clear expectations for our participants, and not only in a workshop but also in conversations. And a really great way to do that in Japan is to not only just use words. Like, everybody has a voice, right? Sometimes that might come across very clearly in a Western context, but we found that matching expectation with a story or with an example is really helpful. So rather than saying everyone has a voice, we say things like, everyone take a Post-it, and each person's to write down what it is that they want to write down, and then we go from individual work to group sharing. So to try to make that a little bit that idea a little bit more tangible, because as we know in many Japanese companies, these concepts are new. So in order for us to introduce something new, we want to not only meet them where they are, but we also certainly want to give them examples of what works well.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, actually, I think we need to back off a bit and actually explain to the listeners or the viewers what design thinking is.
Good point. We jumped straight into the pool. but
the concept is quite clear, I think, to many people who are viewing this or who will watch this later on. Still, maybe you can explain it from your own words in a nutshell.
Sure. So let's just do like the speed version, because we can do the other version at another time.
Sure.
So design thinking is a methodology where you begin with the user and you take the insights and the pains that you have understood from the user, and then you channel that into business aspirations. So it's really about taking a user focus rather than taking like a product focus, and then using those insights and then to create something new.
Right, perfect. That sums it up.
Let's bring it back a little bit more, actually, since we're jumping ahead of ourselves. I'm here to put the brakes, but in all honesty, Brittany, you studied international business, if I'm correct, and your work seems to have been connected.
Remember, yes, correct. That was right.
Your work's been kind of, connected to Japan some way, shape, or form for quite some time. So even, while you were working abroad for Fortune, for example, tell us a bit more about what was the point of initiation for you, for your relation to Japan, and what kind of sparked your intrigue to pursue that further, learn the language, and get more involved in the business scene?
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So the way that actually began for me is really the way that in Germany or in other countries that you learn English as a second language. In Australia, we learn often Japanese. We have a stronger focus on Asian languages. So, for example, my brothers at their school, they actually studied in Indonesian. I don't know how fluent my brothers are in Indonesian these days. However, they did certainly take Indonesian classes. My school happened to be Japanese, but I also know there were other schools who taught Chinese and Korean. So in 1999, the Australian government took a stance to stop teaching European languages and take more of an Asian focus, with the idea that, this is the Asian century in Australia, geographically, on the Asian side. So we should essentially have a workforce that's a little bit more Asia fluent. My Japanese, the very first moment that I was kind of like blown away with Japanese, my teacher walked in to the classroom, turned around to the blackboard, and from, up, down, right to left, started writing. And I remember thinking, that is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. I don't know when, but I want to, at some point in my life, walk into a room, say nothing, and then just start like writing Japanese on a blackboard. That was my initial motivation, but as you can imagine, that is not enough to keep you motivated, for an extended period of time. So that's kind of like where it began. And then, I just love Japanese, like learning Japanese through school, not necessarily like the manga anime side, but certainly the culture, the language, understanding like the verb structure, understanding that if you say kite ageru versus kite kureru, there's a difference between this. They both mean listening, but there's a difference in the terms of, am I doing you the favor? Are you doing me the favor? All these kinds of very interesting things I just, really fell in love with. Fast forward a little bit. I always wanted to do something useful, something effective, something impactful with my Japanese, which is why I wasn't necessarily like an academic where I would, go into to a university and lock myself away in a library and start, pumping out like research papers or white papers. For me, it was so much about how can we take this language and then use it as a tool in order to connect people and do things better. Interestingly, I think kind of like my generation, which is kind of like the generation that did like study abroad in Japan in like I would call it the 2005 to like 2010 bracket, like those kind of people. are the first kind of people that really, I would say, had a different Japan story. The Japan story, if you're kind of, working as a manager or something in Japan, is you came over with a global company and you're an expat and blah, blah, blah. There's this new wave of professionals in Japan. So kind of, I would say, began-ish kind of with my generation, and then, for example, and then now with you guys, that you really began from the bottom. Like you did internships in Japan, you went to study abroad, you lived in a dorm, like you didn't turn up with like an apartment and a house that your company was paying for. And so this is a really interesting kind of profile, and this is a really interesting societal change, because now you're getting, for example, people like, you and I that are now moving through the world of like the business world in Japan with Japanese language and with a context for the Japanese culture. This wasn't the case 20 years ago. For example, if we reflect on like bubble times was everyone go, you don't really need to speak English, whatever, money's flowing, when it rains money, so just go, it'll be fine, and this has changed. This is like very, very different. Japan has now, they have to move away from like this Kaizen approach of cost saving. We have to go into, value creation, and this is what we do by using, methodologies like design thinking. So rather than going and thinking where we can squeeze the towel, for that extra last dollar, I've been speaking to many IT professionals, and they say, we're done. We've done it. We've hit Kaizen, perfect Kaizen, Kampeki Kaizen, 100% Kaizen. There's nothing left to save. So what do? We have to go into new business and new value creation. And how can we do that? Well, one way is you can go blindly through the forest and just hope for the best, or you can use a methodology that's structured that can help you, make good decisions and to make the most of your investment, which is what we do with design thinking now. So that's kind of the full circle.
And can you walk into a room now and actually write Japanese on the wall, on the blackboard without saying anything?
This did happen. I have been able to walk into a room and just start writing Japanese, and people would be like, but also I've also had people like walk into our workshop room. This is like pre-corona times, and then like walk out again because they're like, oh, well, this is obviously the wrong room. And then they walk out. And then they go back to like the information desk, and the information is like, no, it is room 203 or whatever. And then they come back and they're like, ohayou gozaimasu,
So there's a kind of this expectation that you don't speak or write the language, but then they come in and they're like, oh wow, she actually is fluent, right?
Yes, but speaking Japanese is not necessarily a bonus. The better you speak Japanese, the more you are, open to Japanese level criticism. So if you walk in and you're like, ohayou gozaimasu, that's all I speak, everyone's like, sugoi, nihongo da jouzu, like, and they're like, that's really great. But if I'm like, introduce myself in like keigo or like in business Japanese, I'll sometimes get like some quite harsh feedback.
Oh, okay. Interesting. I mean, I've never been in that kind of Japanese business context, so I've never really come across that sort of thing. So I always just presume that they would praise you regardless of the context based on my experience in Japan. But that's interesting that you're getting some harsh feedback on the usage of
maybe they
keigo.
give you compliments on your first day, but after that,
You got it long, that's it.
Anyway, I've read them. I'm walking inside their mind.
I want to ask, what's your opinion? So for a country like Japan that's considered, to be kind of, it kind of has a low appetite for risk, or it's kind of risk averse when it comes to that kind of business, and it's kind of propped up by its neighbors and people around it, and kind of like, how the industry works. So what I'm trying to ask here is, what do you think is Japan's main challenge or obstacle from a design thinking perspective, and how do you go about solving those problems for a country that's kind of relatively risk averse, let's say?
That's a great question. In order to kind of like approach the question, let's understand the risk adversity behind kind of like the Japanese like mindset. We have to understand that if we think of the word tsunami and typhoon, these are both Japanese words, right? So Japan is constantly living under threats, constantly, of natural disasters, things go wrong, and we've also seen like that there's the connection between the quantity of natural disasters versus, the speed in terms of digital transformation and things like that. So the risk adversity in Japan is not simply because they're scared. It's because that they know things are coming and they know things can change very quickly. So if we're going to invest, we have to make sure that this particular project or this particular idea or investment initiative or program can withstand any kind of changes. So the risk adversity is less this kind of we don't want to change. It's when we invest, and when Japan invests, it's like a rocket ship. It's the opposite of like what we see in the West, which is, everyone's on board at the same time. Like, yay, this is really exciting. 3 weeks later, people are like, who's responsible for this initiative again? Is it Bastian? Is it Long? Is it Buzz? Who's doing it again? No one knows. And then, and then it kind of dies out. In Japan, it's very ambiguous 80% of the time, and then once they decide, it's like a rocket ship. All the resources are channeled into one particular program, and then it's all systems go. So, and then also there's this very deep kind of like almost Confucian value of we have to look after the people. So that our business is here not only to make money, but it's really here to serve people. So if you can come with like a new business idea or a new business initiative, and it might be very successful, or it might be very in terms of the business model, it might be a no-brainer in terms of investment. But if you have to then completely restructure the company, or if you have to get rid of 100 people, you're probably going to get a no, because in Japan you don't make decisions simply based on economics. It's social economics is equally important. So let's take that as a frame. For me, in terms of design thinking, what the biggest challenge for Japan is probably the concept of like omotenashi, or this okyaku-san wa kami-sama desu, which means that God is
the customer.
The opposite. Customer is God, right? Customer is God. Why is that a challenge to design thinking? Design thinking is based on the idea of empathy. It's based on the idea that I see you as a person. I see you in all your goodness. I see you in all your pain, and I'm here to serve you, and I'm here to find a way together that we can then move forward. It's very difficult to create empathy for God, right? You're like, how can I connect with God? You can't. So I applaud the Japanese service, this omotenashi, this I'm here for you. But at the same time, I do think what we could certainly work on is this idea of our customers, we want to give them a godly experience, but if we see them as pure gods, how can we create enough empathy to create for them something that's impactful and that can really change their lives?
That's really interesting, and I see where you're coming from. I think it's a really good point. How do you go about teaching that to your clients? I mean, what's the process of getting them to understand that from your perspective as someone who's coming from abroad and trying to teach the philosophy of design thinking to traditional Japanese companies? What's worked and what doesn't, and how did you have you mastered that approach of teaching these clients?
And maybe to add as well, who are your clients, or what are your clients? Maybe before that.
Good point. Yeah.
Okay. Who are my clients? So you would think that maybe like startups and entrepreneurs and creative people are our clients. They're not.
Maybe.
Our clients are Japanese companies that either have a presence abroad or have like a headquarter abroad, and then they have a subsidiary in Japan, and they look you in the eyes and they say, for example, in the case that you have the global HQ like abroad, they look you in the eye and they say, as much as things are going well in Japan, we know we need to change, and we feel like we're not a part of this global story anymore. That we are in part of this like global organization, but because we do things so differently, and we don't have access to resources and material in Japanese, we're falling behind, and we don't want to fall behind, right? Or you get the other side, which is the Japanese company that's 250 years old, and they look you in the eye and they say, we probably should have changed 50 years ago. We haven't. Yeah. And now I'm the idiot in the manager chair. And if this ship goes down, it's me. And I don't want to be the idiot that bankrupts a 250-year-old Japanese company. And then, and then people lose their jobs and things like that. So that's a little bit kind of like the customer profile. In terms of how you get people into that innovation mindset, I would say as much as innovation is, think quick and iterative and things like that, in Japan, you have to work on extremes consistently. So you have to be, this, iterative approach that, that we design in sprints, that, we take information, we launch and learn. But at the same time, the culture change behind the innovation is, I would say, if not equally important, probably even more important. So your job as an innovation professional in Japan is to take all the time your customer needs. So certainly what we need to do is push them along to an extent that they feel comfortable, that they still feel like that they can trust you. So you have to literally push them to the absolute edge of their comfort zone. But at the end of the day, what we're here to do is to not make things change overnight. What we're here to do is create systemic, sustainable change. And the way to do that is to take your time. And the way to take your time is to fall in love with the process and the people that you're working with. So if you're sitting in front of someone and you're like, you're an idiot, why don't you see this is obviously the way to go? I'm not going to lie, like I've obviously thought that sometimes, but it's not helpful. You know what I mean? Like you have to look at this person and say, the reason that you're not investing is not because you don't see the potential, you don't see the business case. It's because you're thinking about, you're taking responsibility for, this department or the people that you're, representing, or how you can better, you don't want to put them in a risky situation. So the more empathy and the more that you understand your client, the more that you can create a tailored innovation program for them. So, maybe they need it short term, and then also think about it. It's not this kind of like, one hit wonder. We don't have to go in, and get it all done in a day. Most of these companies have had these issues for decades, and sometimes. And the other thing we also have to remember is, as much as there's issues in Japan with, change and things like that, we can also really, take solace in the fact that Nintendo wasn't a video game company when it was launched. Toyota wasn't a car company when it was launched, So Japanese companies have been able to reinvent. But what we can do as innovation professionals to help them, iterate and kind of get there a little bit, to make that process a little bit more tailored for them, because if you're a global professional, then you know what the global standard is, but then you also need to have Japanese context. If you're able to meet those two things and then create a really meaningful program to this particular company, you might be able to really change the lives of some people, because Japanese people spend most of their days at the office, or they spend most of their days working. So if the way that you're working, if you can implement a new innovation mindset, or if you can create a new innovation program, you have the ability to change people's lives. And I think when you take that approach, you lose the kind of the hecticness behind it. Just take a breath. Understand that this is a process for everybody, and you as the innovation professional, you have to lead it. And if it's not moving in the direction, find another way, work it out.
And did you also have some kind of negative outcomes, let's say? I mean, I assume that it's actually running quite well, but maybe you have had also some kind of outcomes where you said afterwards, oh goodness, why did it go this way? We've tried everything.
Perhaps to add to that, perhaps you can share a story of a client you have, someone have participated in your workshops and have seen improvements, perhaps, and see what do they feel and what do they get out of the workshops and the programs.
I have to say that we haven't had any disastrous outcomes, because you cannot begin a design thinking process from a disastrous start. So if you do that, obviously you'll get a disastrous outcome. But the disaster stories or the horror stories that we have are not at the end, they're at the beginning. So it's before, it's as we're scoping the project. It's, as we're, designing, or as we're, preparing a design sprint. And the user is a 25 to 35-year-old, young professional who a particular fintech company want to then expand into this market. And the 60-year-old manager says, we don't need to do user interviews. I'm pretty sure we know what they want. And you're like, oh God. So for me, this is kind of the real horror stories come as you're scoping the project with the client. If you're scoping the project with the client and you're getting these red flags, you're hearing the alarm bells, and you continue, That's not their fault, that's your fault. You should draw the line. You should say, I think, we need to take a different approach, or we should start again, or whatever it is. But it's really important in Japan that before you begin, it's not just Japan, it's really anywhere, if you're, working with, user-centric design, and especially in innovation, you really want to ask the right question before you just start randomly building, which is very difficult for companies or countries like Japan and Germany that are very hardware focused, that are very product centric, and especially very like perfectionist as well, to take a step back and say it's maybe not about the product. Like the approach to marketing often in Japan and Germany is this idea of if it's good enough, the people will come, and that's it, what I mean? But that's actually right. It's, so what we want to do is take a step back, and we want to, think about if we're building a product or a service, we want to think about the person and their entire journey. We want to think, if you're building a watch, or if you're building a wearable device, or if you're designing a service, I want you to think about how where is your customer 2 weeks before they decide to call you? What's going on in their lives? Where do they go immediately after leaving your company or your service? Or if you're building a product, what else do they buy? So things like that. So I would certainly say the horror stories in Japan don't come at the end. You don't get these kind of surprises, which is a good thing about design thinking. Imagine design thinking like a map or like GPS. If you get in your car and you put in your destination, and you put in anywhere, right? Where do you go? Nowhere. You go absolutely nowhere, right? And so what we try to do is make sure that we have a very clear destination. So in order to be very clear in that destination, it's a lot of client conversations. There's a lot of sometimes hand-holding that's involved, but we do have to just that's a little bit part and parcel of it. So the real horror stories come at the beginning, when you're looking at a manager and they say, you know what, this 18-year-old girl, I'm pretty sure I know how she feels. And you're like, is that right?
That's so right. Soon as they've decided to do something, it actually really goes off like a rocket ship. Mm-hmm. And I thought in that moment as well, Germany is exactly like that as well. I'm working in the innovation sector as well, more in the cybersecurity and gigabit kind of topics, but it's exactly the same way. They test everything, they discuss a lot. It takes years and years till the decision is made, but as soon as the decision is made, boom, it goes off. It really is fast, compared to America, where they put it just on the market and let's see what's going to happen, and then if something happens, then they debate and they discuss what they should do next, right? They have a very different approach, but Japan is very similar, I think, in that regard. And I think, the startup scene as well is kind of in Japan exactly like that. As soon as they've set the mind on, okay, we're going to create Fukuoka as one of the main startup cities, it kind of blew off. But I have another question regarding the outcomes. So when you are done after the workshop, and let's say 5 years have passed when you've worked with this one company again, do you have any example of you're looking back and say, actually, oh, this has really worked, and they have implemented now by themselves, they've innovated, let's say, their business approach or their way of working?
Well, that's really always the goal. The goal is for us to certainly, be that kind of, carrying the flag and showing them the way. But, what we really want to do at the end of the day is give them, tools and the capabilities internally to be able to lead their own innovation initiatives. Of course, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't need us anymore, but they'll need us at a different maturity level. So rather than going in and saying, maybe we'll begin with quite a simple project, maybe for one that springs to mind, is an accounting process. We worked with a resources company that had a very complex accounting process that essentially went something like 75% too long than they wanted, and they didn't know why. So we gathered all the stakeholders in a room, and the conversation went something like, "You're late. That's why we're late." No. We're late because they're late. Well, they're late because they're also late. Oh my gosh. And then so people didn't actually understand how important each particular part of the process was in order for someone to do their job. So once we kind of got everyone in the room and kind of got on the same page, we were able to, develop a very simple, process that met all of the stakeholder needs. This is by no means mind-blowing innovation, right? But at the same time, solve problems or we're able to solve pains in the company that are very real. So the pain actually of that process was not only the length of the process, and for every double minute that someone is using on this process that takes too long, they could be using it somewhere else, right? But also because it was such a stressful process for the people involved, there was a high number of sick days at the end of each month when they would deliver whatever it is that they needed to deliver. And when I saw that, after we went in and we worked with this particular client and we were able to streamline their accounting processes in a way that was meaningful to all of the stakeholders, when I saw that the number of sick days also dropped, for me that was really important, because I'm like, this is what it's about. It's about creating new ways of doing business. It's about new business models. It's about innovation, but at the same time, it's about innovating how we work. It's about creating a space for people that they just don't have to go home sick and stressed. And, and so for me, that was probably one project that stood out. But if you were to look at kind of like the innovation potential, you're like, so what, But for me, this is kind of a really good example, because it shows you, as an innovation professional, you don't go in and say, this is what you need to do, everything blockchain. You know what I mean? This company's like, hang on a second, we can't even get our pay slips in on time. So just relax on the blockchain. You know what I mean? So this was, for me, it's really important. It's about the user. It's about, redesigning how people work so that they are just happier and healthier in their lives. But it's also about meeting the client where they are and what they need. So it's not necessarily about bringing in the latest innovation simply because it's the latest innovation or the latest technology. It's about bringing something meaningful to a client that will encourage them to invest in the next initiative. So it's not about going, and blowing their minds with, oh my gosh, this is the most, tech thing I've ever seen. It's about how can we get them from step one to step two? And how can we help them internally raise enough capital and raise enough investment so they can invest in the second innovation program? Because you have to look at this very pragmatically. You have to say, where's the money coming from? If they're calling you because they've lost, they don't have any more, they don't have the capital that they once had access to because they've only ever done Kaizen, what's your job? Help them hire you. Create business models for them, create new income streams. So it's not necessarily about, I'm the innovation professional, finance is your problem. When you start looking at it kind of like more holistically, and you're like, okay, I can get you from 0 to 1, and then we're going to take we're going to take the value that we created from step 1, and then we're going to invest that in step 2, rather than turning up and saying, hi, here are 10 innovation initiatives all over, and like 10 million or 100 million yen that I recommend that you implement over a period of 6 weeks.
I kind of want to draw this whole conversation actually to design thinking Japan, like the company itself, but maybe Buzz along have still another question. Otherwise, I continue.
I had a quick question actually, just in terms of approaching clients. Since you mentioned, clients are typically companies that desire to change but haven't done so yet or don't know how to at this point. Do you usually approach these clients or do they come to you? What's the process of that?
That's a great question with no one straightforward answer. So the thing that we found effective in communicating about innovation is to become a trusted partner in innovation. So the way that I do that is to create enough content, both in English but also in Japanese as well, so that Japanese clients can see in their own time and on their own terms, because they honestly, they do have very kind of basic concerns like, does she speak Japanese? I have in my LinkedIn, yes, I speak Japanese, but if they see me, for example, on the Business Karaoke podcast, interviewing like the country lead of Dropbox in Japanese about cloud technologies, they have a different level of kind of like trust. Oh, okay, no, actually, she actually does speak Japanese. We can actually call her. You know what I mean? So there's that. So the one thing that I would encourage, especially when you're looking for kind of clients, is to put as much content out there as possible for the simple purpose of not necessarily client acquisition, but for trust assets. Each piece of content that you create is an asset of trust that someone will find at a time that it's useful for them. So for example, if we think, when do we know that someone is ready to innovate? We don't have no clue. I have no idea when someone is ready. I have no idea. So what they would do is then go on the internet and they would start like looking themselves, I want to do this or I want to do that. And then, so my job is when they are ready themselves, that I'm as easy to find as humanly possible. So that's the number one thing. But probably the most common way that we kind of get clients is that you'll have like a global firm that had done design sprints and innovation abroad, and it's gone perfectly well, right? And they had and they now have their innovation office either in Singapore or in Sydney. That's kind of like the APAC region where you have your innovation offices. But this is the story. Well, Tokyo and Japan is actually doing really well financially, but we actually have no idea why, and we don't even really know anyone in the Japan office. And so you're like, okay. So sometimes they'd go and they'd either bring some Japanese over to Sydney or they'd bring some Japanese over to Singapore, teach them the process, and they'll say, okay, you've seen the design sprint. Are you good to go? Are you ready to take it back to Japan? And the Japanese are like, yeah, we're ready. They go to Japan, nothing happens, right? So then my job essentially is to help. I'm like there's a lot of Japanese, especially at an innovation level, innovation management level, that are just short of allies. And so that's my job. My job is to not necessarily lead innovation for them. My job is to be their ally within the company, to give them enough, creative confidence to begin that process.
Mm-hmm. So, actually, it relates a bit to one of the questions I had talking about your Business Karaoke podcast, which I really like. I've been watching and following it.
Thank you. It means so much to me.
Thanks, Buzz, for bringing it up. Are the people you're talking to there, they're definitely from your network, but are there previous clients as well, or are there some current clients, or is it just really you reach out to them by yourself on LinkedIn or email or whatsoever, or do they come to you? Like, I just want to know where they all come from.
Okay. So none of them are clients. I'm just doing a quick scan. No, none of them are clients. I think if I were to ask my client, like some of my clients to come on, they would say yes, but I don't know if they would want to. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, so I haven't asked my clients just yet. I still have to, probably map, just check the temperature a little bit, like on that. Mm-hmm. However, here's a really fun fact for anyone that's doing that or that has an interest between, like global business in Japan. LinkedIn in Japan is like LinkedIn in like 2014 abroad. So 2014 abroad, people would like respond to you, but now you just get like, stupid. I get stupid requests like, if you're looking for a job in Japan, apply here. Kidding me? Have you even seen my profile? Do you mean so? It's just super lazy recruiters and lazy marketers, So the quality of LinkedIn amongst the Japanese community is very high because there's still low adoption rates. So if you reach out to a Japanese person on LinkedIn, they're most likely to be a little more open, a little bit more kind of open to new things and a little bit more open to the global market. So for example, like the Uehara-san, who's the CMO of Dropbox in Japan, he was a complete cold call. Like I literally just was like, I saw a press release that Dropbox had supported the Kumamoto prefecture in moving their processes to digitalize their processes and to bring them to the cloud. And I thought, I wonder what that's like. I wonder what it's like to go into a Kumamoto prefecture office, right, which is in Kyushu. So the further away you get from Tokyo, like the less, metropole you kind of feel. So it's really kind of like, with all respect to Kumamoto, I actually studied in Kagoshima for 3 months, which is why I feel I can say this, but it's really middle of nowhere. It's really middle of nowhere. And in terms of, this is what Hassan. He's also the nicest guy, by the way. Super, really nice guy. And he talked about essentially what it's like to help, a Japanese prefecture office bring to the cloud. And he talked about, that and this was essentially to also come back to what we were talking about today, which is don't push them where they want to be. Obviously, imagine what kind of services can Dropbox provide. Like, imagine like the kinds of cloud, support that they can provide is just really, really quite remarkable. But he's like, what we had to do is we had to go from crawl to walk, and then from walk to run, and then from, so he saw it as a process as well. So, for example, he was a complete cold call, things like that. And then I've had like a few other people. The best thing is once you start getting probably, I would say, like a ratio of about 10 episodes, you can cut. Some people start recommending people, and then you can like reach out and be like, I talk to you. And the thing is that I've found, super interesting is that if you call someone and you're like, hey, do you have 5 minutes for a coffee? People are usually like, no, of course not. So anyone on that list, if I were to ask them, do you have time for a coffee, would have said like flat out, no. You know what I mean? It would have been a flat no, because, they're busy people, they're, industry leaders. They don't have time to have a coffee with me. But if you give them a reason to call, or if you give them a value proposition that doesn't exist in other areas of their lives. So, for example, you're creating content for them, or you're interviewing them. This is something that people are usually open to. I've never had someone tell me, no, this is a dumb idea. Like, of the people that I've reached out to, I've never had someone say, no, this is a dumb idea. I've had people say, no, because this whole like COVID thing is so crazy for our business. We can barely, get through the week in terms of, so please, this is not a no, but it's a no right now. So what you have to then understand is, take this podcast or take your, content creation the same way that you take, innovation, and understand that it's going to be a process. And say, okay, great. If I can get the CEO of, Spotify on, in not the Swedish one long where you are, but the Japanese, if I can take like the Spotify MD in Japan. But obviously, with streaming and everything right now, super busy. But I have to understand maybe he's ready in 6 months. Okay, great. Put it in my calendar. I'll call him again in 6 months. So there's that. The only time that I've kind of like had someone say I can't is because they're like, no, we only manage our PR through. Oh no, we only manage kind of content through a PR agency, which is also still quite like a Japanese model as well. Like, no, we don't speak publicly. We only do it through PR and stuff. So I found that like a little bit different. But apart from that, like the support has been really amazing.
Excellent point. Yes, I like what you're saying. And I think I've experienced it myself during the LinkedIn time. During the Corona time. I was wondering. We talked about it before the live show, actually. But why did you actually start the Business Karaoke live stream or podcast?
The Business Karaoke podcast is because I'm obsessed with talking about innovation and design thinking in Japan. I'm obsessed with it. And maybe that's come across a little bit like in this interview. It's something that I'm really excited to talk about. I will talk about anything from, what are the socio-cultural, influences, but also we have currently, in the process of planning, speaking with a Japanese architect about, what is it like, what kind of Japanese design principles can we use in our offices and stuff. So I'm like obsessed with talking about any angle from what it's like to do business in Japan, how we can do business better. So I'm obsessed with talking about that. I used to do this, or not used to, but like in our like pre-corona times, we would like have our weekly workshops, and I would talk about design thinking and innovation with probably like 150 professionals a month, usually on average, sometimes more. And then when Corona hit, we're obviously like went to remote work, and then, we talked about it like a little bit less. And then I thought I have to talk about it. I have to hear what people have to say, And so that's kind of like where the initial motivation came from. But the motivation is continuing because I kind of like look back and think 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I was kind of getting into what is it like to do business in Japan, there was no real story about someone who represented me. There was no one that had gone and studied abroad and spoke Japanese and, had like a Japanese context. It was kind of like literally bubble Japan, and that's it. Like all content after bubble Japan, like just stopped because Japan was no longer this, huge, financial partner, even though like they're the third largest economy in the world, things like that. But this kind of like free flowing money thing, when everyone says, oh, Japan's going into, recession, but we've heard that for like 30 years, you know what I mean? But they're whatever. So yeah, the motivation really comes from creating a story, creating a modern dialogue around doing business in Japan. And also, in innovation, the importance of ecosystems and partnerships and collaborations is, we just can't stress it enough. So if you look at like the larger Japanese organizations that have literally rooms full of cash, like literally post-war cash treasure chests, and corporate Japan is very cash rich. It's very cash rich, because they know that bad times come. They didn't know the coronavirus was coming and the Olympics would be canceled and things like that. But they knew, okay, every couple of years something crazy happens, and they always have money to back it up, which is why you haven't seen people be cut. You haven't seen employees be cut like they have abroad. You haven't seen, people like reduce their hours. You haven't seen people like reduce their pays, because Japan knows that their economy is designed in a way to absorb risk, to absorb these kinds of shocks, rather than to kind of like reflect or deflect kind of against them. And I just really wanted to talk more about what it was like to do business in Japan today, so that the more that we talk about it, the more stories that we have, the stronger the community is, that then through that we can create more of an innovation kind of DNA within Japan.
And so I'm aware of the time. 5 years from now, where would you like to see the Business Karaoke podcast?
Oh my gosh. It's so funny because, I think in different times, you'd have a different answer. But I recently heard someone say, do the next right thing. Do the next right thing. And I think that's really important. For me, the goal of creating an innovation ecosystem in Japan through equipping people with the tools for change is something I'm probably going to do until I die. I don't know what it's going to look like. Right now, one of the ways that we do it is through our Business Design Thinking Japan. Another way that we do it is through our meetup, which is the Toyoko Design Thinking meetup, where we talk about everything from what's the connection of calligraphy to design thinking. Well, here's like a really interesting point. So when you're sketching or when you're writing things, what do? Usually breathe in, hold your breath, write, and then when you're done, you let go, right? But the calligraphy artist was like, breathe in, and then as you're writing, breathe out, and then write. She's like, then your notes become much more clearer and things like that. I'm like, I never thought about that. So we talk about, of like the cultural assets of Japan and how we can translate that into like digital value. That's what we do in our meetup. And then the Business Karaoke podcast is talking about people that have done business in a new way in Japan that are interested in innovation. Maybe they're not innovation professionals, but for example, like we had people who brought Australian wine to Japan. So for example, 15 years ago in Japan, wine was Italian wine, German wine, French wine, and that's it. It was European. It was like very sophisticated. Why would you drink, such low class wine like Australian wine or Californian wine?
It's
Why
good
would you
though,
do
I have
that?
to say.
And so there was a woman that essentially was responsible behind this kind of like change and now people drink, Australian wine in Japan. They didn't 15 years ago. So she wouldn't necessarily say, hello, I'm an innovation professional, but she certainly did. She created a new market. So I'm just really looking forward to keeping on documenting stories around doing things differently so that we can learn and we can save ourselves a little bit of time. Like, hey, this worked or this didn't work. So in terms of like 5 years from now, I'm sure that the essence of what we do will certainly be the same. What that will look like, Bastian, is your guess is as good as mine.
Right.
That is a fascinating way to conclude, I think, since we're running a bit close to our time here. Brittany, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any thoughts or stories you'd like to share with the audience before we conclude?
Well, you tell me. What do you want to know?
I have actually one final question. So most of our listeners, I believe, are still, international students, still for sure. And we're trying to expand, of course, our listener network. Though I think, when I look at your LinkedIn, and it has become very popular among, young people, I'm fascinated. I'm amazed at how well you handle it and how much you use it as a tool actually to expand your network, to connect with people, to get to know people. Do you have any tips and tricks maybe for youngsters who would like to start out on LinkedIn and build their own brand, perhaps?
Okay, are you ready for the next hour that we're going to? No, so talk about something that is interesting. So, okay, let's begin from the beginning, right? So let's go pain. Let's begin from pains. What's the problem when you're a student? You have zero credibility. You've done nothing, right? So guess what? Don't pretend like you have. Don't pretend like, oh, I worked with a Fortune 500. If you haven't worked with a Fortune 500 company, don't worry about it, So what I would just say is take a deep breath in and look at where you are, right? And so think about how you can create content that's interesting or meaningful for people. So if you look at, for example, like in your classes right now, or if you're in your tutorials, or the essays that you're writing, I'm sure that if you, instead of looked at this piece of content as I have to do this for university, if you took this and said, this is an opportunity for me to contribute to industry knowledge with recommendations or with thoughts, then maybe that like your thought process will then change a little bit. If you start uploading your essays, you can upload them, why not? But obviously like essay structure is super boring, so please like create it like a way in a little more like engaging. But I'm sure what you are saying is interesting. So take what you redesign it, repurpose it, reposition it in a way that it's meaningful to somebody else, and then start pushing out this content, right? Then what happens? You have 4 years of content or 3 years of content. And then when people say, and when employers are starting to look at you, like for example, an interesting thing now is people don't ask me if I speak Japanese anymore because they know, just go online, you can see it. People don't ask me anymore. And people are like, oh, have you done the JLPT, whatever, 1N1, whatever? No, I haven't. Just go and see me, leading an interview on cloud technologies in Japanese, and there you go. You know what I mean? Like I haven't done it. So what I would say is, honestly, look at LinkedIn as a place that don't worry about trying to like make recommendations, industry recommendations or anything like that. Simply document things that you're interested in. And so, for example, your interests might be different. So if you're interested in marketing, or if you're interested in like Japan, for example, then share what it's like, or what kind of, resources or what kind of apps that you use. Try to create stories. So don't worry about like creating content in a way that it's, like an industry professional or that you're an expert. Just take a step back and think about, how can I document my process or my learnings? Another really, great way to use LinkedIn when you're expanding your network is to not just say, hi, I'm this person, and I like Japan or whatever, and that's why I want to connect with you. What I would say is engage in discussion, engage in communication, and engage in conversations. The Japanese kind of LinkedIn world is it's kind of a little bit more like overseeable. It's a little bit more like tangible than, for example, like English, or everyone kind of speaks, not everyone speaks English, but the kind of the English content is just there's so much out there already. If you can go and then comment something that's like interesting or a little bit more niche, then you can really stand out. So if you use LinkedIn rather than a way to showcase your learning, showcase your achievements, showcase learning. So for example, if you read kind of like my LinkedIn, it's or my articles, or if you follow the Business Karaoke podcast, it's not about me telling people what they should do. It's learning conversations that I've had that other people might find valuable. So I think just take a deep breath, take the pressure off yourself that you have to produce something that you simply don't have, and use this to your advantage as a way to create, even new content, or to even start new conversations. I would also recommend don't underestimate like the randomness of the internet. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't think anyone would really be interested in like design thinking innovation in Japan, but there are people that are interested in it, and I think that's really interesting. So, like Japan, Germany, and like food. I'm sure there's a lot of people that are interested in that. So start talking about it. Yeah. This was my first article. I think I wrote it in like 2017. And also, it's so funny because some of my other articles that I've really put in like a lot of like time and effort. Like the one article that took me literally, I'm not even joking. I think, Buzz, you're doing the computer right now, right?
I am, yes.
You're managing it? Oh, yeah. So one that literally took me 3 weeks to write was an article called Performance Reviews in Japan, like how to give performance reviews, like how to do better performance reviews. Literally took me like 3 weeks. I poured my heart and soul into that like article, and I think it didn't really like resonate with people. However, one article that took me like 20 minutes to write, which was like how to present in your non-native language, literally was shared like 50 times or something.
Oh no.
So you'll never know what kind of like content resonates with people. So just keep on putting out, and don't worry about being too like boxed in. Like, for example, I love talking about design thinking innovation in Japan, but don't worry, take a moment and talk about something to the left and to the right of that. So, for example, something that people have been really interested in is the fact that I lead workshops in the Japanese language. Like, oh, but you're not Japanese. But how many other people lead? Workshops in English and it's their second language, and nobody thinks that's amazing. But just for some weird reason, me speaking Japanese is kind of like a novelty. I don't know. So just keep on putting content out that's meaningful to you, and content that if you just think about, content or even, just start a conversation that you wish somebody else started if it's not out there. That's all I did.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Brittany. It's been a pleasure, and a big thank you to all that are tuned in today. Don't forget to like and follow Bento Bureau on Facebook, Instagram, and all the other social media channels we're on. They're all in the links in the description, and you can also find Brittany Arthur's work, Design Thinking Japan, the Business Karaoke podcast. Be sure to subscribe to that as well. You can find all of those links in the description of this video as well, so be sure to check it out and show her some support. Thanks so much for tuning in, and if you enjoyed this, please like the stream and subscribe for more talks on Bento Bureau. Have a lovely Saturday, everyone. This is Bento Bureau signing off.
ごちそうさまでした。
ごちそうさまでした。